kind of nice to put all of Anne's hard work together in a nice seminar.
Yeah. I see a lot of my students are here.
That's good. Oh, I have to consent to being recorded. Okay. Yeah, Anne's looking for postdocs. It's so...
Oh, wow.
I know. It feels like time is just flying by.
Where is she applying?
She mainly wants to work for Natalie Mahowald.
Yeah, yeah.
But she's looking around though, mainly in the East Coast. But yeah, she's looking at like doing a combination of chemical analysis and then incorporating that into model. I think she really got inspired by working with Natalie for her phosphorus deposition paper.
Yeah. Looks like people are still trickling in, so I'll give them one more minute.
Oh yeah, we got time. It's only 1 minute after. I was gonna say 4, but it's 1.
All right, well, looks like we're not too many more people are jumping on, so we can go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming today, and join me in welcoming Cassandra Gaston. She's an atmospheric chemist who specializes in the measurement of aerosols and their interactions with trace gases, which affect climate and air quality. Her research focus is on African dust transport and its impact on ecosystem and human health. She's currently an assistant professor at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School and leads research at the Barbados Atmospheric Chemistry Observatory. So Cassie, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, and I just want to thank Kate and Alex for inviting me to give this talk. So I'm really excited to share with you some of our research that we've been involved in, just trying to understand the role of not just African dust, but African aerosol transport on biogeochemical cycles. So before I get into it, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators, in particular at Cornell, at University of Michigan, in French Guiana, and then also at PNNL, and then also point out that this is pretty much a culmination of my student Anne Barkley's work that I'll be showing today. So before I get into this, I just kind of want to back away and just make sure that we're all on the same page with thinking about aerosols, since this is going to be the focus of the talk. So typically when I ask people what aerosols are, they usually give me an answer about something that's coming out of a spray can that might be affecting the ozone hole. But that's not what we're going to be talking about for the purposes of this talk. So we're going to be defining aerosols or particulate matter as liquids or solids suspended in the atmosphere. I'm going to mainly focus on solids, so I'll be using the terms particulate matter, aerosol, and particle kind of synonymously to refer to the same things. So for those of you who aren't maybe familiar with thinking about aerosols, I kind of think of them as like microscopic grains of sand that you might pick up from the beach. However, what I'm showing here in this image from the US EPA is that these particles are actually a lot smaller than that. So what you can see here is this is an image of a human hair, and you can see these little blue and pink dots. These represent, the blue dots represent particles that would have a diameter of less than 10 micron. And then the pink dots are even smaller particles that would have a diameter of less than 2.5 micron. And what you can see is that several of these can fit around one of your strands of hair. So I often get asked, well, why would you study something that's so small? How could this have any sort of an impact? And the answer is because there can be a lot of these particles in the atmosphere, and they have real tangible impacts on health as well as climate. So just focusing first on the health impacts, what I'm showing here is a deposition of different particle sizes in different parts of the body. So what happens is you can inhale these aerosols, and the bigger ones can get lodged in your upper respiratory system, where they can exert impacts like irritation, maybe an allergic response. The smaller particles can actually go deep into the lungs, and they can have more adverse impacts on lung function as well as cardiovascular health. Aerosols have been receiving a lot more attention in terms of their health impacts, because there's been a lot of evidence that aerosols are a really key mechanism for spreading the COVID virus responsible for the current epidemic. Talk today, though, is going to focus on the impacts of aerosols on climate. So there's a few different impacts that are focus of pretty intense research. So particles can scatter and absorb incoming sunlight. So this is a direct radiative impact. Aerosols facilitate the formation of cloud droplets and ice crystals in the atmosphere. So aerosols play a really key role in clouds and precipitation and hydrological cycle. And then finally, particles can deposit nutrients into ecosystems that can affect primary production. And it's this last impact that I'm really going to focus my talk on today. And so thinking about African dust and why that topic, why would I study something like that? It's because African dust transport actually affects a pretty large swath of the globe. And this is actually represented pretty well in this satellite image here. So what I'm showing is dust that's being transported from the African continent across the Atlantic Ocean, and it's making its way towards South America and the Caribbean islands. So we can actually observe dust transport in these regions, and then also as far north as Bermuda and also parts of the northeastern US. So this dust transport has a really major impact on aerosol budgets, not just over the oceans, but over other countries as well. And I want to highlight here is Barbados. So this is the easternmost island in the Caribbean. And this is where we actually have a long-term measurement site that was first founded in the 1960s by Joe Prospero, who's emeritus faculty here at UMiami. And my research group has taken over operation of this site. So this is a photograph of the measurement site. So we have a tower here on the easternmost part of the island where we collect daily filters using high volume aerosol sampling. And then these filters get shipped to my lab where we process them, look at dust concentrations, and then we do other chemical analyses as well. And what this measurement record has enabled is an over 50-year time record of African dust concentrations, which has really been key in understanding aerosols in general and their impacts on climate. So a few key things that we've learned from this long-term record. One is that African dust transport has a really strong seasonality to the Caribbean and to North America. So this transport peaks in the summertime. Second thing that we notice is that there's a lot of interannual variability. So through this long-term measurement record, we start to see the imprint of things like El Nino, La Nina affecting dust transport, as well as changes in African climate. So changes in precipitation and changes in levels of drought can actually have an impact on how much dust makes its way to the Caribbean and to the Americas. And this is really important for thinking about how climate might impact these emissions in the future and what that might mean for clouds, ecosystem health, as well as human health. So what I'm showing here is the 3 main measurement sites that are currently being operated by the University of Miami. So we make measurements here at the Rosenstiel School, in addition to in Barbados. And then I'm going to mainly focus my talk today on this 3rd measurement site, which is more recent. This is in South America, in French Guiana. And we've been making long-term measurements here for about six years now. And what's unique about that site is that it's receiving dust during a different season. So it receives dust during winter and spring. What I also want to point out in this plot here is just the sheer distance that the dust is being transported. So these are really not trivial distances. The dust is being transported over multiple days, making its way from the African continent to the sites. And so I also want to present some results from my group can be efficiently transported over such long distances. The other thing I want to point out from this figure is that just the sheer magnitude and just the sheer amount of dust and how much of the globe this is affecting. Our site in Cayenne is about 4 degrees north, and our site in Miami is at about 26 degrees north. So this is encompassing a really wide latitudinal swath of the Atlantic and of the Americas. And so this is having a really major impact for thinking about things like global climate. And so some of the research that my group, as well as with collaborations with other universities, have been thinking about in terms of this dust transport phenomenon is, what does this mean for direct radiative forcing? What does this mean for cloud formation? This has been a particularly interesting question for collaborators who are interested in the role of dust in suppressing potentially hurricanes. And also thinking about what does this mean for ecosystem health, which is what I'll focus my talk on today. We've also become more interested in the impact of dust on air quality because these dust transport events can actually cause exceedances of particulate matter guidelines set by the World Health Organization. There's also really high levels of childhood asthma on some of these Caribbean islands, which is unexpected. And there's been questions about whether the dust might potentially explain some of these high levels. So I also want to draw your attention to this recent dust transport event that made the news. I don't know if a couple of you saw this, but it was this so-called Godzilla dust event that received a lot of media attention. And what I'm showing here is just a satellite image of the massive dust plume that made its way off the coast of Africa towards the Caribbean. And when it hit the Caribbean islands, we noticed an immediate impact on levels of particulate matter. So on the right-hand side, what I'm showing is measurements from our station in Barbados. So we saw an immediate jump in aerosol optical depth and a decrease in the angstrom exponent, as we'd expect. And compared to previous measurements using our Sentinel instrument, these are the largest optical depth measurements that we've ever seen. And then what I'm also showing is levels of particulate matter measured by air quality groups in Martinique. So this is a nearby island. And what you can see is that we have background concentrations of around 10 micrograms of aerosol per cubic meter of air. But then these levels jump quite sharply up to almost 400 micrograms per cubic meter of air when these dust fronts come in. And so this is really showing, this has really raised a lot of questions about, well, how frequently or how unusual are these Godzilla dust events going to be in the future, and what that might this mean for air quality and climate. So I'm going to now shift my attention from the Barbados record to thinking about the winter and summer and the wintertime transport. And so it's a really nice figure from this Diatoms et al. Paper. What it's showing is seasonality of dust transport using slices from the Calypso satellite. So the Calypso satellite provides vertical profile of aerosol. So what's shown in this plot here, we can look at the longitude, the latitude, and also the vertical profile of dust transport during different seasons. And so we understand the summertime dust transport phenomenon fairly well, mainly because of this Barbados record that's provided 50 years of data. So we know that we usually get strong transport in the summer at high altitudes, and that this dust can make its way as far west as the Yucatan Peninsula. But we know a lot less about the wintertime transport phenomenon. So what happens in the winter is this red line here in these plots represents the position of the intertropical convergence zone. So what happens in winter and spring is this ITCZ shifts south. And when that happens, this facilitates African dust transport to more southern latitudes, including to South America. And so, but there's been very little work on documenting this phenomenon. There's been remote sensing work, but there's been little in the way of ground-based measurements to sort of quantify how much dust gets transported and what the impacts might be. And so one thing to note about this dust transport phenomenon during winter and spring is that it's an annual event. It's very understudied, as I mentioned, compared to the summertime transport phenomenon to the Caribbean and to the southeastern US. But it's thought to be really important in terms of biogeochemical cycles. This dust is thought to fertilize the Amazon rainforest, as well as the tropical Atlantic Ocean. So it's thought to be a really key player in climate, but it's very understudied. And so this is what motivated us to think about looking into getting a long-term, setting up a long-term measurement site in South America. And I've highlighted Cayenne here in this satellite image because, as you can see, Cayenne is right on the coast of South America. And from the satellite image, it's receiving the brunt of this dust transport event that I'm showing in this image. And so we've recently established a site in Cayenne, and this is in partnership with the local air quality agency that's Atmo Guiana. And we use the same sampling protocol in Cayenne that we use in Barbados. So this is a Google Earth image of our measurement site. So it's in Cayenne, which is in the country of French Guiana. Our site is actually removed from the city. So it's out on a little peninsula. We don't have a measurement tower at this site the way that we do in Barbados. So what we did is we established our site, our measurements on top of a hill. And we're right along the coast of the tropical Atlantic Ocean, as you can see in this image. This is another image of our site, and this is actually a picture of our high volume sampler. So this is the exact type of sampler we use in Barbados. And so we use the same protocol where we have daily aerosol filter collections with a high volume sampler. And what we've noticed from 6 years of measurements is that we don't really get local influence from the city itself. We're really just getting sea spray and long range transport from Africa. So this is making it an ideal site for looking at African dust transport. And from high split forward trajectory analysis, which basically allows us to look at what happens to the air masses after they pass over Cayenne. We notice that a lot of the air masses continue on into the interior of the Amazon. So it's a really good site for being able to understand how dust might influence the interior and the heart of the Amazon basin. And so what I'm going to focus on is this connection between biogeochemical cycles and climate. And so that's what's depicted in this cartoon here. So what happens is you have aerosols that are being transported, in this case from Africa, and these aerosols can deposit out into terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And these aerosols can contain really key nutrients that are essential for biological functions such as photosynthesis. And in the case of forests, if the chemical or mineralogical form of these nutrients isn't too terribly important, that's because once the aerosols deposit out into the soils, they can undergo weathering and chemical modification So any nutrients that aren't necessarily biologically accessible can be transformed into a more accessible form. But this is a different case when we think about the ocean. So in the ocean, when aerosols deposit to the surface, they immediately start to sink out. And so the particles only have a finite amount of time to affect marine productivity. And this is where solubility is really key. So the chemical or the mineralogical form of nutrients found in these aerosols is really important for their impacts on marine primary productivity. So solubility will also be something that I touch on in this talk today. So once biologically accessible forms of nutrients are deposited, this can stimulate primary productivity. And then what this can do is this can facilitate the drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide and its sequestration into the marine and terrestrial biospheres, thus having an impact on climate. And so for this talk, I'm going to focus on this central question of, is dust really this key player for fertilizing the Amazon and the tropical Atlantic Ocean? And some reasoning for why this has historically been thought to be the case is that dust contains both phosphorus and iron that are really key nutrients for primary productivity in these ecosystems. So for example, the Amazon basin is phosphorus limited, whereas the tropical Atlantic Ocean is actually nitrogen limited. However, the deposition of phosphorus and iron can help stimulate nitrogen fixation. I'm also going to touch on particle size. So large coarse and super coarse mode particles, so these are particles with a diameter of greater than 10 microns, could be quite important for nutrient deposition. But these particles are typically not included in biogeochemical models. They're assumed to deposit very quickly near their sources and not undergo significant long-range transport. But I'll show some data today that suggests that maybe we should rethink this. So as I mentioned, Saharan dust contains iron and phosphorus containing minerals that are thought to fertilize both of these ecosystems. However, the ability of this dust to fertilize, particularly the tropical Atlantic Ocean, is a bit more questionable. And this is because dust contains mineral forms of phosphorus and iron, such as apatite and iron oxides, that are highly insoluble in seawater. And so this suggests that the dust might only have a very limited impact on marine primary productivity. However, what could happen is that dust could interact with acidic gases in the atmosphere, such as nitric acid or sulfuric acid. So these form particularly when you have anthropogenic emissions of nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide, which leads to nitric acid and sulfuric acid. So when dust is processed by these acids, it can increase the solubility of iron and phosphorus containing minerals. And we know this from laboratory studies, but a key question is, how often does this actually happen in the real atmosphere? This is particularly the case in remote regions where the levels of anthropogenic emissions aren't particularly high. So this will be something to think about while I give my talk today. The other thing to also keep in mind is it's not always all just about dust. There's other aerosols in the atmosphere. And so there's other sources of iron and phosphorus that contain intrinsically much more soluble forms of these two elements that might actually be more important to think about than just dust. And so we'll also touch on that during my talk. And so I'm first going to address the question about phosphorus sources using data that we collected in Cayenne. So what I'm showing here is a year's worth of aerosol mass concentrations collected in Cayenne. The black line is PM10 measurements that were made by our collaborators at Guiana. And then the red is dust mass concentrations that we made, that we extracted from filters. And so what you can see is that there's pretty good correlation between PM10 and dust, particularly in winter and spring. And this is when we have active dust transported from Africa to the site. And so if we look at phosphorus measurements during this time period, What I'm showing here in the top panel in red is dust mass concentrations. The bottom panel is showing phosphorus data. So the blue is total phosphorus, and then the green is soluble phosphorus. And the green asterisks represent measurements of soluble phosphorus that were below the limit of quantification. And these data points are actually going to be quite key for part of the talk today as well. And then the black in the upper panel is basically taking the ratio between the green and the blue, so the percent soluble. And so what you notice is that we get some pretty strong episodes of dust transport to our site in winter and spring. And concurrent with these dust transport events, we also see increases in the blue, the total phosphorus, which is what we'd expect because the dust is providing apatite, which is a phosphorus containing mineral. So if we take our phosphorus data and compare it to our dust mass concentrations, what you can see is that there's a pretty strong correlation between the total phosphorus and the dust, which is what we'd expect. The correlation between SP, or soluble phosphorus, and dust, which is shown in the middle plot in green, shows a moderate correlation, but there's a lot of spread in the data. And then the bottom panel actually shows an inverse relationship between percent soluble and dust mass concentrations. Now, this bottom relationship actually wasn't completely unexpected. Other groups have also seen this kind of relationship, whereas dust mass concentrations decrease, there's an increase in the percentage of soluble phosphorus. And there's two schools of thought really that have attempted to explain this. The first is that smaller dust particles, which would contribute less to dust mass concentrations, they have a higher surface area to volume ratio, and so they're more likely to be more efficiently processed by acids. And that could be explaining that inverse relationship. The second explanation could be that there's something else, some other aerosol source that's present when dust mass concentrations are low, that could be explaining this inverse relationship. So to try to understand which mechanism is most dominant in our measurements, what we did then was we compared we also conducted these phosphorus measurements during non-dust season. So mainly focusing on fall when dust mass concentrations are low. So what I'm showing here is the exact same data that I showed for winter and spring. All of the different colors take on the same meaning as in the previous slide. However, this is for the fall season. And what you can see is that the dust mass concentrations have fallen by about an order of magnitude. But what was really surprising to us was that if you look at the blue trace, the phosphorus concentrations have at best fallen by a factor of 2. So the phosphorus levels are much higher than what we would have expected. What was even more surprising to us was that the soluble phosphorus wasn't really that different between the fall and the winter and spring. So again, if we look at these relationships between our phosphorus measurements and dust, we only see a modest positive correlation between total phosphorus and dust, but we see absolutely no correlation between dust and soluble phosphorus. And so this is begging the question, what's going on during this fall season? What is the aerosol source that could potentially be responsible for this highly soluble phosphorus that we observe during non-dust season? And so what we concluded was that we were actually seeing the impact of biomass burning that was transported from Africa. And I'll walk you through our evidence for how we came to this conclusion. So what I'm showing here are high split frequency plots. So these are air mass back trajectory plots that basically tell you or give you an idea of where the air mass came from before we sampled it at our site in Cayenne. So the top panel is showing these plots for the winter and spring, and then the bottom panel is showing these plots for the fall. And so in winter and spring, we're mainly sampling air masses that are coming from Northern Africa, which would include North African dust. And then in fall, we're sampling air masses that are coming from Southern Africa. Now, why that's important is because the seasonality of these air mass back trajectories actually matches the seasonality of the burn of biomass burning in Africa. So this is a figure taken from this Roberts et al. Paper. What it's showing is that in the winter and spring season, Northern Africa experiences its burning season, suggesting that we might be receiving the co-transport of dust and biomass burning in the winter and spring. And then what we can see in this Roberts figure, again, is that in summer and fall, Southern Africa experiences its burn season. And so this suggests that we might be also seeing biomass burning emissions making their way to our site in Cayenne. So further evidence for this was obtained using scanning electron microscopy of our filters. So what I'm showing here is a representative image taken from one of our filters from winter and spring. So the circle on the left shows a dust particle, and then on the right is a soot particle. And so this was a common feature that we saw in our filters, the co-transport of dust and biomass burning. And then in the fall season, all we saw was pretty much soot particles, again suggesting that we were seeing a strong biomass burning fingerprint in our samples. Now, why that's significant is that unlike dust, phosphorus in biomass burning is thought to be incredibly soluble. And so this might be driving the solubility trends that we're seeing during both seasons. So further evidence from this can also be taken if we compare in a little bit finer detail the seasonality of burning in Africa, taken again from this Roberts et al. Reference, and we compare it to our measurement record. So NH stands for Northern Hemisphere and SH stands for Southern Hemisphere. So what we see is that in February and March, we see a peak in the burn season in Northern Hemisphere Africa. This is when we see pretty high levels of soluble phosphorus. And these levels of soluble phosphorus drop to below the level of limit of quantification in April and May, which is when the burn season starts to come to its end in Northern Africa. Now, if we do the same thing for our fall data, we can see a peak in the Southern Hemisphere African biomass burning in September and October, concurrent with our observation of high levels of soluble phosphorus. And again, in November, we see this drop in soluble phosphorus to below the limit of quantification. And this also matches the timing of when the drop in the burn season is also observed in Africa. So we also confirmed the same seasonal trends using satellite products as well to confirm that we saw the same trends in our data in 2016. What's also notable is that our high split black trajectory plots, so where the air masses are coming from, is also shifting away from Southern Africa further north, again suggesting that when we're not getting the supply of biomass burning, our levels of soluble phosphorus drop off. So, but this still doesn't quite answer the question fully or prove that this is 100% coming from Africa, right? Because South America also exhibits its own burn season as well in the fall. And so we wanted to know, is this really transported from Africa, or is this some sort of a local fingerprint that we're seeing? And so to answer this question, what we did is we combined high split back trajectory analysis with remote sensing products derived from the Calypso satellite, which, as I mentioned, provides vertical profiles of aerosol. So what I'm highlighting on the left is a representative high split trajectory, back trajectory, and then these colored boxes represent periods when the Calypso satellite actually intersected our air mass as it was making its way towards our measurement site in Cayenne. So if we start furthest back in time and closest to the African continent, what we see in this black box here is an elevated plume of smoke that's overriding the marine boundary layer. And if we go a little bit further in time or further forward in time, again, we see the same elevated smoke plume overriding the marine boundary layer. Now, these Calypso observations were also corroborated by measurements in Ascension Island that were made during the LASIK campaign, where they also observed elevated smoke plumes during these same time periods. If we follow the air mass all the way to our measurement site in Cayenne, again, we see the same elevated smoke plume making its way all the way to our measurement site. So on days when we had detectable levels of soluble phosphorus, we saw this type of transport phenomenon, suggesting that these smoke plumes are indeed providing the highly soluble phosphorus that we observe in fall. Now, on days when we didn't observe elevated levels of soluble phosphorus, the Calypso data looked a little different. And so what you can see is that our Calypso data shows an elevated smoke plume, but that elevated smoke plume starts to taper off as we get towards our, as we move forward in time. It doesn't make its way all the way to our measurement site. Again, providing even stronger support that we're seeing an imprint of biomass burning from Africa. So then what we did is we wanted to understand, well, what kind of impact is this going to have for phosphorus deposition to the Amazon basin and to the tropical Atlantic Ocean. And so to answer this question, we collaborated with Natalie Mahowald's group in Cornell, and we worked with the CAM model using our data as model input. And what I'm showing here are the fraction of phosphorus from African dust in red and African biomass burning in blue deposited to the Amazon as a function of month. So the plot on the left is showing total phosphorus, and the plot on the right is showing soluble phosphorus, or abbreviated as SP. And so what you can see is that African dust is indeed providing a substantial amount of phosphorus to the Amazon basin, particularly during dust transport season. But even during dust transport season, we see contributions of smoke, African smoke, to phosphorus deposition to the Amazon basin. And so this is really significant. So from these model estimates, we estimate that the smoke is providing a substantial amount of total phosphorus, up to half of what's deposited to the Amazon, and almost all of the soluble phosphorus that's deposited. And so because this biomass burning is providing such a soluble form of phosphorus to the Amazon basin, we wanted to know what are the impacts going to be on the ocean as well. And so what I'm showing here is another CAM model simulation, but this time for the oceans. This is conducted over the entire year. And what this is showing is the percentage of soluble phosphorus deposited from smoke compared to other aerosol sources, such as dust. And so what you can see is that in the southern Atlantic Ocean, including in the southern tropical Atlantic Ocean, we see contributions of soluble phosphorus, both from biomass burning in Africa as well as from biomass burning in South America. But what was really surprising to us was this arm coming and affecting, or this plume of smoke affecting soluble phosphorus deposition to the northern part of the tropical Atlantic Ocean. So we had originally thought that all of the soluble phosphorus would be coming from the dust, but what you can see is that there's a clear impact from northern hemisphere African biomass burning as well. And so our estimates are that this biomass burning is providing on the order of about 20 to 60% of the soluble phosphorus deposited to the tropical Atlantic Ocean. Now, I want to point out that these estimates are likely an underestimate. Because we did this simulation for the global ocean, we actually didn't tune these model outputs to our measurements. And so likely this is an underestimation. Now, what I also want to point out is this swath of biomass burning that's making its way towards the Southern Ocean. And so what this is suggesting is that this smoke from Africa isn't just affecting tropical ecosystems, but it's also affecting parts of the higher latitude oceans. And so the Southern African biomass burning might be playing a significant role in nutrient deposition to the Southern Ocean as well. So next I want to move on to thinking about iron containing particles. So this is recent work that my student has been doing. So we've been using single particle analysis to characterize the size and diversity of transported iron containing aerosol. Again, trying to answer that same question is it all about dust, or should we be thinking about other particle types as well? So we performed computer-controlled scanning electron microscopy coupled to energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, which is that CCSEM EDX. So this is basically providing information about particle type, size, morphology, aspect ratio, which is just a length to width measurement. I'll explain why that's important in a bit, as well as composition. And we've also started to get into iron speciation using Mossbauer spectroscopy as well. And so our most commonly observed particle type was mineral dust. So what I'm showing here is an SEM image on the left. This allows us to look at the morphology and also help identify the particle types. And then on the right is the EDX spectrum corresponding to this particle. So this is giving us elemental analysis or an elemental fingerprint. And so most of the particles by number on the supermicron mode were dust, characterized by these high fraction of aluminum and silicon that's typical of aluminosilicates found in most dust particles. We also saw a lot of evidence for mixing of dust with sea spray aerosol, as evidenced by this peak in sodium and chloride as well. What was really surprising to us, though, is we didn't see a lot of sulfur in these particles. And so this is suggesting a lack of chemical aging of dust particles, even after being transported such a long distance. So this was quite surprising and has implications for thinking about things like iron solubility. And I also want to just quickly note that by EDX analysis, the iron was roughly 12% by weight. This will be important for when I talk about other particle types. So other particle types that we observed in the supermicron mode included primary biological aerosol particles, or PBAPs, as well as biomass burning. But what I really want to focus your attention on are these freshwater diatoms mixed with dust that we observed consistently in our samples. And so to the left are two SEM images of what these particles look like. So you can see a fragment of a diatom frustral in the top left image. And then on the bottom left image is a more intact tubular shape, which is a type of diatom. And then to the right are the representative EDX spectra. So these only represented about 4% of the particles, but they had very interesting morphology and chemistry that I'm going to focus on. So we were surprised to see a fair amount of iron on these particles. And the amount of iron, as I'll show, scaled with the amount of dust associated with the freshwater diatoms, averaging about 4% by weight, which is pretty significant. And I'm going to argue that these are actually not coming from a marine source, and that these are likely coming from African paleolakes. And so this is likely from diatom-bearing sediments called diatomite. And this is actually really interesting because it begs the question of where is the dust coming from? What paleolakes in Africa? And that's something that my student is actually looking into now using geochemical fingerprinting. And so I'll walk you through our logic as to why we don't think diatoms are coming from a marine source. So first, we never observed these diatoms on non-dust transport days. We always require transport from Africa, which is not what we'd expect if these diatoms had a local or marine source. Second is that greater than 95% of these diatoms were internally mixed with dust, including inclusions that were found on the inside of the diatom frustral. So that's what I'm showing here in this SEM image. So I have a couple of blown up or close-up images to the right. You can actually see this dust on the inside of the diatom frustral. Now, this is not expected if this were simply a sampling artifact where the dust was landing on top of the diatom. And finally, we actually compared the diatoms in our sample to a sample that we obtained from the Bodeli Depression, which is an African paleolake that's also is also the strongest dust emitter in Africa. So there's been a long-standing hypothesis that the Bodeli Depression is actually responsible for providing much of the dust that fertilizes the Amazon basin. And when we compared this sample from the Bodelli Depression to our diatoms in Cayenne, we see the exact same diatom species. Now, this doesn't necessarily suggest that the dust that we receive in Cayenne is coming from the Bodelli Depression, but it does suggest that we are receiving transport, or that these diatoms are coming from African paleolakes. So we wanted to know more about these dust inclusions that we found on these diatoms. And so we worked with collaborators at PNNL to perform electron mapping. And what this basically does is it provides spatial distributions of individual elements. And so the SEM image for this particle in particular is on this upper left-hand panel. And then what I'm showing is the different elemental distributions. So the elemental maps show that the diatom frustules are comprised of silicon and oxygen, which is what we expect for a diatom frustule. And then we see sort of more patchy distributions of aluminum and iron, showing the internal mixing with mineral dust. What I've also highlighted in these white circles are iron inclusions. So we actually measured these iron inclusions, and we see that these inclusions range in size from about 0.1 micron up to 4 micron. And because they're smaller than the diatom itself, and also we see them on the surface of the frustule, this could potentially enable faster dissolution and also acid catalyzed solubilization because of their surficial location. We also looked at the size distribution of these different particle types, which is what I'm showing in this plot here. So pink is dust, green is freshwater diatoms with dust, which we've abbreviated as FD. And then the primary biological aerosols are in blue. And I've also highlighted the super coarse mode. As you recall, these are the particles that are greater than 10 micron in size that aren't typically thought of as undergoing efficient long-range transport to receptor sites, such as in South America. What we notice is that the dust is enhanced in the smaller of the supermicron mode, but all three particle types contribute to the super coarse mode. And the freshwater diatoms in particular appear to be enriched in the super coarse mode. And so this really begged the question for us, how are these large particles being transported so far away? We would expect that because of how large they are, they would deposit rather quickly out of the atmosphere, but clearly that's not the case. And so to answer this question, what we did next is we measured the aspect ratios of our particles. And so what I'm showing here is a figure that's adapted from this Wong et al. Reference that just came out recently from Jasper Koch's group. And so what we do is we measure the length to width ratio of our particles. So a length to width ratio of 1 implies a spherical particle, and a length to width ratio greater than 1 implies an aspherical particle. Now, why that's important is because asphericity affects particle drag, which affects particle settling velocity. So I'll give you an example. If I were to drop a bowling ball and a feather at the same time, the feather is going to take a lot longer to reach the ground. And that's mainly because of the drag that the feather experiences compared to the bowling ball. And so this asphericity is increasing drag, causing it to deposit more slowly out of the atmosphere. And so what I'm showing here are aspect ratios plotted as box and whisker plots. So this is plotted as a function of size for our 3 different particle types. And I've highlighted the freshwater diatoms with dust because they show the most interesting patterns. So what you can see is that for all 3 particle types, actually, the aspect ratio increases with increasing particle size, but especially so for those freshwater diatoms. And so this is going to really increase the drag on those particles. So if we factor in the fact that these freshwater diatoms have such high aspect ratios, and also that these freshwater diatoms are also a lot less dense than dust, we estimate that these diatoms are going to have a 35% slower depositional velocity in air compared to dust. And this might facilitate their long-range transport more easily. Now, if we apply the same principle and think about, well, what does this mean for these freshwater diatoms depositing onto the surface ocean? We compared freshwater diatoms to dust and looked at their sinking velocity. And we find that their sinking velocity in seawater is going to be on the order of about 70% less than the sinking velocity for dust, meaning that the freshwater diatoms are going to have a longer time in the surface ocean to undergo dissolution processes. And so these might be efficient nutrient vehicles. So to conclude, what we've shown is that dust is an important source of both phosphorus and iron transport to the Amazon and tropical Atlantic Ocean, but that mineralogy and other sources are really important as well. In particular, African biomass burning was shown to be really important for thinking about phosphorus. So we showed evidence that the biomass burning can provide up to half the phosphorus deposited to the Amazon, and it's estimated to be a more important source of soluble phosphorus than dust to some parts of the ocean. What I also want to emphasize is that this biomass burning is being transported year round from northern and southern Africa. And so it's also going to impact phosphorus deposition even during dust transport season. We also showed evidence of diatomite from African paleolakes containing dust inclusions and high percents of iron that were detected in the Amazon for the first time to the best of our knowledge. And we argue that these are actually pretty efficient nutrient vehicles for the ocean because of their light density and their high surface area to volume ratio and their aspect ratio, which increases with particle size. We argue that these three aspects are going to facilitate a slower sinking velocity in the surface ocean, increasing the time for iron dissolution. So with that, I'll leave up my acknowledgement slide and I'll be happy to take any questions. And thank you.
Thanks, Cassie. So if anybody wants to ask a question, I can monitor the chat room, or you can just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask Cassie the question yourself.
Hi, Cassie. This is, I should put my video on. This is Charlie Zender. We spoke earlier. Thank you for that really integrating talk, like one that really just nailed all aspects of our department in one fell talk. So I wanted to ask two questions. One's short, which is, you showed what you thought the fraction of soluble phosphorus was that might be carried on biomass burning sources.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a similar estimate for the fraction of soluble iron that might be carried on dust sources to the Amazon basin?
That's a great question. I know this is something that Natalie Mahowald's group has been very interested in, which is why we contacted her about getting those deposition estimates as well. So her group is finding increased evidence that the biomass burning is also impacting soluble iron deposition as well to the oceans as well as to the Amazon.
So do you think that's the dominant source of the soluble iron, taking into account the different solubilities of iron in dust versus biomass burning?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think that, from what we've been seeing in our preliminary Mossbauer data from our dust samples is that we actually see a surprising amount of fairly soluble iron. So I do think that the biomass burning is going to be more important, but I do think that the iron coming from dust is going to be more soluble than we thought.
Okay. And my second question was, you alluded to there's a bunch of other aerosols in the atmosphere besides dust, and you talked about biomass burning.
Mm-hmm.
So, what in your mind is the third most important for phosphorus and for iron?
Well, definitely biological aerosols are incredibly important for phosphorus. I do want to say though that, the results that I showed are more specific to our particular measurement site. I think that the dominant source that's going to be most important is going to change regionally. For example, If you look at the Mediterranean, there is a lot of influence from biomass burning, but you do have more evidence that dust is being acidified in that region. And so it's likely that acidified dust might actually be more important than biomass burning in that region. So it's really going to vary depending on the location. But yeah, no, I think in terms of phosphorus, biomass burning, as we're seeing, it's becoming more and more pervasive in the atmosphere. Dust and biological aerosols seem to be the key players there. For iron, certainly biomass burning and dust and industrial emissions as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Joanna Tavares. I'm Kate's student. Thank you so much for your talk. This was fantastic. I have two questions too. So my first one is, do you think that the intrusion of these diatoms from the Paleolakes, I mean, I'm assuming that the nutrients, that specifically the iron, they're not coming from the diatom itself, right? It would be dust as well, but trapped in really fine mode. But so we're still talking about a mineralogical source,
Right.
a sedimentary source, not a biological source, because those diatoms would just be silica frustules by now, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So basically what we're arguing is that the diatom is an efficient carrier of fine iron-rich dust. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And do you think that there is also some acidification potential for the way that this, I'm assuming that that dust was trapped in the frustules really long time ago, and perhaps they've been processed in a way that the dust that you compare with, which would be more recent dust, would not have been weathered, right? Chemically modified?
That's a good question. So I should preface and say that the STM-EDX analysis that we did, our detector couldn't look at nitrogen containing compounds. We could look at sulfur, but not nitrogen. So it's been traditionally thought that most of the acidification processes is actually occurring through interactions with sulfuric acid. But it is possible that you are getting interactions between these dust particles and nitric acid. I think the real question, though, for the processing is, yes, it's certainly possible. I mean, multiple lab studies show that these reactions are very, very efficient. I think the real question is, how feasible is it, though, in the real atmosphere? How much contact time does the dust have with these different acids? For one, these are really remote regions, so that begs the question, how much acid is there in the first place? And then for two, the dust transport, as I showed in those vertical profiles from the Adams et al. Paper, especially in the summertime, the dust is being transported aloft, right? And so there's a real question, if the dust is aloft and most of your pollutants are in the marine boundary layer, how much interaction do you get between those two air masses, and how much heterogeneous reactions can you actually facilitate to age the dust? I don't think that that's particularly clear. There's been a lot of controversy over that particular topic, mainly because there just hasn't been a lot of measurements that have probed the mixing state of the dust to say one way or another whether the dust is actually being aged or not during transport. It's a really important and an understudied question.
Thank you. My second, so I'm studying the impacts of ship emissions as a potential source for iron and nitrogen to the ocean. So when I was looking at one of your plots, would you mind explaining how that data is collected? It's maybe towards the last third of your talk. You had a plot of sulfur, I think, content.
This?
More? No, it's before the diatom surprise, which was amazing, by the way. The suspense that you keep in like some of the parts of your presentation, I'm like over the edge. I'm like, go back. It's when you have this clear triangle over the ocean. It's a world map. It's a projection of the Atlantic, and you show that right there.
Okay.
So can you mind going over this again?
Sure. Yeah. So this is the percentage of soluble phosphorus deposited from biomass burning compared to all other sources of aerosolized phosphorus or soluble phosphorus. So this would include dust, PBAPs, volcanic emissions.
That's model. That's a model.
Yes.
Output.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
This is from the CAM model. So one thing that I actually did forget to mention is that in this CAM model simulation for the Amazon, we actually tune the measurements or tune the model to our measurements.
You mentioned that towards the end of the slide. But so what you're using there for input for the model is the amount that left the burning areas.
Yes.
And then how much you got at the other end.
That's right. And this is because this was not tuned to our measurements, there are a couple of important caveats to point out. And I'm glad you asked this question. One is that, yes, it is being tuned to emissions and then using meteorology to sort of induce the long range transport. So one thing that we found when we used our data as model input for the Amazon estimate was that we didn't have to do much to the dust. We scaled it by about a factor of 2, which for modeling purposes, that high of a factor, right?
Okay.
For the biomass burning, we actually had to scale up by a factor of 60.
Okay.
And
yes.
the reason we think that that's the case is because of a few factors. One being that it's possible that we don't really know the levels of phosphorus in different fuel types from biomass burning. Like that isn't clear, like how much phosphorus is going to be emitted from different fuel sources. 2, we also know that there's historically an underrepresentation of biomass burning in a lot of these models. And then 3 is the key question of plume injection height. So for instance, if I take a biomass burning plume, but I don't put it high up in the atmosphere, it's going to deposit more quickly than if I do put it higher up in the atmosphere. So getting the plume injection height is really key. And that was the key theme that came up in AGU last year, was a lot of these biomass burning campaigns when they attempted to model their observations, they noted that the models are likely putting the biomass burning plumes too low in the atmosphere, and that's why they're not undergoing as long range transport as they should be.
And so what height did you use for that one? For the output that we saw?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know the answer to that.
But it's higher than what most people would put.
Well, what we basically did was instead of increasing the height, we basically just scaled what made it over.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that's what we did. We scaled to match.
Did you lose? Would you just sacrifice some sensitivity, or did you see like an error going up because of that scaling up, or that was kind of dealt with internally?
I mean, we basically just scaled to match our observations in this case. Okay. But in the case of the deposition to the oceans, we didn't. Because our site is upwind of the Amazon basin, but our site is only one point over the global ocean. So we didn't see it as fair to scale or to use our data as model input. And so that's why we argue that this is likely an underestimate of the impact of biomass burning on the oceans. And we know that's definitely the case because if you look at the Northern Hemisphere, you don't really see much. But we know from our measurement record in Barbados that we do see a pervasive influence of biomass burning from Africa, but that's not captured in this model representation.
Got it. Thank you so much. This is fascinating.
Great. I'm glad you liked it.
Do you have any more questions for Cassie?
Can I ask a question? I'm not from UCI, I'm from Chapman University. My name is Ramesh Singh. I would like to know, have you ever observed enhancement in water vapor associated with the dust storm? Why I'm asking, because in India, in the western part of India, we are getting dust, which is coming either from local western part of India, Thar Desert, or it is coming from Arabia. And there I observed the enhancement in the water vapor and also mixing all the greenhouse gases. So have you ever observed this?
So typically what we observe when the dust makes its way to our measurement sites is it's usually coming in what's called the Saharan air layer, or SAL. And these air layers have a very distinct characteristic of being quite dry, actually, in comparison to the marine air that we typically get at these sites. So we actually see drier air make their way when we have these dust intrusions. So no, we haven't really seen an enhancement in things like humidity. In terms of the greenhouse gases, you know, I can't say that we really have seen an enhancement during these dust transport events. I do know that there was a recent talk from, I think, Vernon Morris's group, where they were talking about these ship measurements that they were making actually following the dust plumes in the Lagrangian, and they were looking at profiles of things like ozone and other gases. So that actually might be some interesting data to look at to see if there's some similarities between what they're observing off the coast of Africa and what you're observing in your measurements as well.
Thank you.
Any final questions for Cassie? All right, well, in that case, I think let's just join in a round of applause and thanking her again. And thanks so much for visiting us today, Cassie.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. And yeah, I was gonna say, if anyone is looking for a good postdoc that is capable of this type of work, my student Ann Barkley is looking. So please do feel free to contact me if someone is looking for a postdoc. And also if any students are looking for a postdoc position, I'm actually looking for a postdoc as well. So just thought I'd put that out there.